Thank you, Senator Welch. Senator Grassley.
Yeah. Ms. Peters, would the Bureau of Prisons let correctional officers supervise adult inmates if the officer hadn't successfully cleared an FBI National Crime Information Center background and fingerprint check?
Senator, it's my understanding that our policies and practices require that background check prior to employment.
Well, if that's the case, I'd like to say something not just for you, but for my colleagues. If folks who haven't passed an FBI background check aren't allowed to supervise adults, we shouldn't give them custody of unaccompanied alien children. However, the Office of Refugee Resettlement doesn't require FBI background checks for all sponsors, and it refuses to give law enforcement information on the sponsors, even if the child's well-being is in question. It seems to me this would have to stop, and I hope this committee brings in more witnesses on this subject and takes up meaningful legislation to protect our kids. Mr. Horowitz, I'm going to take advantage of you being here to ask a follow-up question. I wrote you on November the 2nd last year about your review of the Justice Department obtaining phone records of members of Congress and staff. In response, you said your report will likely cover most, if not all, of the 8 categories of information that I asked for. It's been said that the Justice Department obtained these records to investigate alleged leaks related to the discredited Crossfire Hurricane investigation, but I'm concerned that the Justice Department used this as an excuse to keep tabs on Congress as we conducted oversight of the department relating to the Crossfire Hurricane. Can you provide an update on the scope of your review and when you expect to issue your findings? And the second question related to this is, did the Justice Department apply the same investigative standards to its agents and staff or other officials in the executive branch who may have leaked the information, as did members of Congress and our staff?
Thank you, Senator. And I'll give you an update on timing and where we are. We are planning to cover, as I said in my letter to you, the issues that you referenced and the categories we spoke about there. We are actually in the process of drafting the report. So we will hopefully be able to get out in a reasonable amount of time. I will just add, because so much of these issues to cover highly classified information, as you know from our prior reviews, we have to go through the department and the various intelligence community processes to get it to the point where we can issue it. So I always put that caveat on any reports we have that involve classified information. But we are working to get it done. We've made good progress. And the second question you raised, the issue you addressed, is one that we're also assessing.
They do exactly the same thing for their own staff.
That's one of the issues we're assessing, and we will report on that, Senator.
Okay. Director Peters, in February 2024, Justice Department's Inspector General report on deaths in the Bureau of Prisons facilities found the FCC Hazleton had 14 deaths from 2014 to 2021. Last year, September 12th, 23, I, along with Chairman Durbin, Senators Manchin and Capito, wrote to you about additional allegations of serious misconduct occurring at FCC Hazleton. Some of the allegations include prison staff falsifying records involving releasing the wrong inmate, prison escapes, inmate medical assessment, time attendance sheets, and staff's physical assaulting inmates. So do you, you've yet to respond to our letter. Why not? And what are you doing to straighten out the significant problems at Hazleton that we've thought, that we brought to your attention?
Thank you, Senator. Well, we take all of those allegations very seriously, and when we learn that someone has not done the job that we've required of them, we investigate it and hold them accountable. Hazleton, like many of our institutions, is suffering from a lack of staffing. We are having difficulty recruiting and retaining there. One of the things that we have done recently is we've actually closed down a unit in order to deploy staff to the rest of the institution. And so, like I said earlier, recruitment and retention is crisis at the Federal Bureau of Prisons, and Hazleton is not alone in that problem.
Is the problem that I brought to your attention entirely related to the number of people you have on staff and nothing else?
Senator, I think it's a variety of things. We talked about contraband and having to tackle the very serious issues of contraband inside our institutions. As you look at the older facility of Hazleton and the maintenance repair backlog, I think that can add to it. I think we also have to talk a lot about the work that the Inspector General and I have been working on to clear up our backlogged investigations, the number of staff that we've added to our Office of Internal Affairs. When I started, there were less than 30 employees in that office, and now we're looking at almost 150 with direct oversight directly to central office in order to not only shore up that backlog, but to hold people accountable in a swift and sure fashion.
Thanks to both of you for answering my questions.
Thanks, Senator Grassley.
President Biden has repeatedly claimed that he wouldn't raise taxes on anyone over $400,000. The president's budget includes $5 trillion in new tax hikes, with much of that targeted at corporations and businesses. Of the $5 trillion, approximately $2.7 trillion is targeted primarily at corporations. Now I quote or refer to the executive branch study. On its website, Treasury Office of Tax Analysis provides a distributional analysis for all taxes. That analysis shows that households with incomes below $310,000 bear approximately 37% of the corporate tax under current law. Using Treasury's own analysis, isn't it accurate that those earning under $400,000 would see their tax burden increase at the very least by hundreds of billions of dollars just under the corporate tax proposal alone?
Senator Grassley, I'm happy to look at that analysis, but we took a lot of time working with Treasury to make sure none of our proposals impacted those making under $400,000. If the assumption is corporations will pass on any tax increases the president's asked for hardworking Americans, that is something we should all be concerned about. But all of his proposals are focused on those people that make over $400,000, and frankly, most of the tax proposals will hit those in the top 1% and 2% earners in this country.
Well, this estimate is by Treasury, and you said you work with Treasury, but then they're giving you conflicting views compared to what I quoted. We have also data from the Joint Committee on Taxation suggesting taxpayers under $400,000 would shoulder more than half of President Biden's corporate tax hike. And I think you keep forgetting that corporations are nothing but a sheet of paper. They're management, they're employees, and they're customers. And everything that corporations pay is passed on to somebody else. So you got to get over this, that tax increases on corporations affect workers by 27%, I think is what, 37% is what your own Treasury Department said. As part of his budget, President Biden fails to include an extension of the 2017 tax law. Based on information supplied by the Joint Committee on Taxation, approximately 70% of the benefits of the tax law flows to taxpayers earning under $400,000. That equates to approximately $2 trillion tax hike on those earning under $400,000. So I want to make an important point. That's not that not extending these tax cuts would be a direct violation of the president's pledge, and that. So My next question is this. The nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office has been providing Congress with an independent analysis of the president's budget since the 1970s. In recent years, CBO hasn't been able to re-estimate all the proposals in the Biden budget, citing a lack of details from the administration on several multi-billion-dollar proposals. So would you commit to providing CBO with the necessary information it needs to provide Congress with an independent assessment of all the policies in the president's budget?
Congress absolutely needs CBO's analysis, and I've never heard this concern from CBO, and I'm happy to take that back, Senator Grassley, but we will provide CBO what they need to do this independent assessment.
Okay. My last question is, the president's budget estimates that making Obamacare subsidies permanent for higher income earners, some of whom make over $200,000 a year, will cost $273 billion over 10 years. This is a 67% higher than what you estimated 3 years ago. Enrollment only explains half of this increase. Obamacare subsidies are growing 4 times greater compared to total national health expenditure. Could you explain this re-estimated $110 billion increase in Obamacare subsidies to high-income earners? And keeping in mind enrollment only explains about half of this increase, why do Obamacare subsidies cost much more than overall health care costs?
Well, Congressman, I want to thank the senators that supported extending the premiums to Americans. We are very proud of the fact that enrollment has increased substantially under the Affordable Care Act. Happy to go look at the analysis, but I think the good news story here is more Americans have access to health care through the Affordable Care Act. As some states pull back on Medicaid, it is incredibly important that we ensure that Americans have health insurance. It will cost us more in the healthcare system if we did not have this critical program at this juncture. So I'm happy to look at the analysis you have, but frankly, the good news story is we have more Americans covered under this law, and we will continue to push to make these premiums permanent.
You can't explain the $110 billion, in other words, is what you're telling me.
So I'm saying that enrollment is why the costs have gone up, and I'm happy to work with your team to see what the difference in numbers are. I'm not in the habit of answering analysis that I haven't seen, but I'm happy to take that back.
I thank my colleague. Next is Senator Grassley.
I'm going to bring up a problem with your department, very same problem I'm recently having with the environmental EPA. So it isn't just your department that this might be a problem, but last month I wrote oversight letters to 15 HHS contractors and grantees. Those 15 organizations received some of the largest contract awards for the care and placement of unaccompanied children. My oversight work is based on new information that shows many children may have been placed in a very dangerous situation. I want to know what these contractors are doing to ensure children's safety. In response to my 15 letters, your department sent an email to contractors and grantees on February 28th that I want to quote. Kindly direct Senator Grassley's office to HHS's Office of Assistant Secretary for Legislation for this request, end of quote. My staff have been told by contractors that they're ready to respond to me, but HHS instruction has so far caused them not to. Do you accept the premise that recipients of congressionally appropriated taxpayers' money must respond directly to congressional oversight requests? And I hope you can answer that positively, that they should. If not, when will, if you would agree with me, when would you direct your staff to clarify to recipients on my letter that they must respond to Congress. Now, we had EPA saying these letters I sent to other groups spending taxpayers' money, that they could respond directly to me. So can you say that for your department?
And Senator, as a former member, I too wanted to be able to conduct oversight when I was in the House of Representatives. And so absolutely, these contractors, the various entities, Americans have every opportunity and right to respond directly to you. We offer to provide them with some guidance if they wish to have it. They were under no obligation to get it, but you are absolutely within your rights, and they are as well, to be in communication.
Okay. So as a follow-up, just let me be very clear. These folks that I wrote to have received together billions of dollars of taxpayers' money. When I and my colleagues send them requests for information, they have an obligation to respond, and this administration's interference, which evidently we're not going to have anymore, at least for a while, has been obstructive. Then another question, if HHS receives a law enforcement request for information relevant to a child's trafficking investigation, does the HHS provide that information to law enforcement without requiring a subpoena?
Mr. Chairman, we work on an ongoing basis with law enforcement throughout the country because, again, we have custody, temporary custody for minors. And so we continue to work with law enforcement throughout the country. Yeah. We follow the rules. In some cases, we're dealing with very private, sensitive, confidential information. And so we make sure we follow the rules so we don't violate any individual's privacy at the same time that we're fulfilling our obligations to respond to law enforcement.
Are you saying in some cases you can direct directly to law enforcement without a subpoena? And then are you saying in other cases you might need a subpoena?
We try to make sure that we're complying with the law when it comes to providing information. Some information is more confidential than other pieces of information, so we make sure that we're not violating any privacy rights, any protections in providing information, whether it's to law enforcement or any other entity.
This will have to be my last question, and then I'll submit for writing answers. At last year's budget hearing, you and I discussed supporting rural health care, including the need for CMS to fully utilize the Rural Community Hospital Demonstration Program. Right now, CMS is only using 25 of its statutory 30 hospital spots for this program. You told me last year that HHS would, quote unquote, do more to support rural hospitals in need. Following our discussion, I wrote CMS administrator. Then at my request, the CMMI director met with 2 rural hospitals interested in joining the program, but that's where the progress stalled. CMS explained that in order to fill the open spot, it would require 12 months of work and too many hospitals would be interested. If CMS has the tools to help one rural hospital and isn't, you should be doing something about it. I realize you might not know about every program at HHS, but why doesn't your department want to help 5 rural hospitals through this program? It's budget neutral, and Congress has reauthorized it 3 times since 2003.
I know time has expired, Mr. Chairman, may I respond?
Just briefly.
Briefly, Senator, let's follow up on this, but what I will tell you is if you take a look at the President's budget, and we can get back to you with a number of the projects that we've undertaken in rural America, we are doing a great deal, especially with many facilities that are on the verge of closing, and that would be even worse for many parts of rural America. But let me follow through with you on your particular concerns, because we have quite a bit to talk about when it comes to our work in healthcare for rural America. And this budget, as you will see, makes major investments in rural America.
We're going to have to move on. Senator Menendez.
Here low. So in addition to being a complex program, it's also facing the same sort of understaffing challenges that the whole agency is facing. Thank you.
I thank my colleague, Senator Grassley.
Yeah. Remote work is a problem throughout the federal government, not just with Social Security. But I want you to know that I hear from Iowans that are getting in-person assistance at field offices is a real challenge. And I recently read about your organization entering into a memorandum of understanding with employee union that expands this episodic telework. So how are you going, by the way, I think this is something you and I discussed when
Yes,
you
sir.
came to my office. I didn't try to get a commitment out of you on anything on that point, but I did want to point out to you how I thought that your predecessor probably lost his job because he was taking on this effort to try to get more people to come to the office. So how are you going to serve seniors when there's even more remote work than there is now?
Yeah, Senator, let me share with you that on February 2nd, we changed our telework balance, and this is the sum and substance of it. I said, look, I'm here 5 days on site, 5 days a week, every day of the week, and if I'm not here, I'm in one of the regions or catching a Dawn's Early Light flight. My commissioner's office, the commissioner's office at headquarters, is there 4 days a week, 1 of telework. All of the other components, 3 days a week, 2 of telework. Now, the field offices have been open 5 days a week, 9 to 5, ever since the shutdown ended. That's a fact. We also do a pretty decent job of getting people appointments within a reasonable time. We can debate what reasonable is, but they also answer the phones in the field between 3 to 5 minutes. So, but this item that you touched on, the episodic telework, was simply this. When I was I can't remember whether I was in Kansas City or San Francisco, a young dad who worked at our teleservice centers said, my son was really sick. I needed to get him to emergency care right away, but my wife was coming home and was going to come off her job and relieve me. I asked my supervisor, could I come in and work the second half of the day? And she said, no, we don't allow that sort of episodic, granting of a half day or something. And so when it came time for us to bring everybody back to the regional headquarters, everybody back to the Baltimore headquarters for more days, the question was asked, are we going to allow them to take a personal half day and telework on those days if some calamity happens, sick kid, a flat tire or something? And I said, well, sure, we're not monsters, we're human beings, life happens. And they said, well, what about for the union organized workforce? I said, don't they already have that? And they said, no. I said, well, that's not fair. I mean, do they not have sick kids? Do they not have flat tires? So I don't want that to distract you, though, from the larger movement, which is to have core collaboration days at the headquarters, to keep those field offices open 5 days a week, 9 to 5, and to make sure that we see people. We're doing all of those things, albeit with a lot less staff than before, but we're not going backwards and doing more telework.
Both Trump and Biden are running on a campaign of not cutting Social Security. I think that's a stupid thing. They aren't serving the future generations they should by running on that sort of a platform, but that is their platform. And obviously, if they do nothing, they are not going to cut it in the next 4 years. But we all know that by 2033, based on what your studies show, that it's going to go from 100% down to 77% of scheduled benefits. Now, is that a cut to you? I'm not asking what Trump and Biden would say about it, but if you go from 100% to 77%, isn't that a cut?
Absolutely. If Congress isn't able to avert it, as you all did in 1982, that would be a real hit to people.
Yeah. The Social Security Act requires the Board of Trustees, which includes the Social Security Commissioner, to report on trust fund financial status by April 1. It's frequently missed. Can Congress expect that report April 1st, and if not, why not?
Yeah, we were hopeful that we were going to be able to get it to you, but there was data from the U.S. Census that was late arriving, so we won't make the April 1st, but it will come shortly thereafter. It'll be a delay of a few weeks, but not a few months.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank my colleague. Senator Carper's next.
Yep, thanks very much. Welcome.
Thank you.
Expires next year. I just want to wave the saber to say that when it expires, we're going to fight like hell to make sure it doesn't continue to expire. With that, thank you very much, and I give you back 8 seconds.
Thank you. Senator Grassley.
Yeah. Let's start with the president's $5 trillion tax hike and the fact that he says that nobody under 400,000 is going to pay anything. And then let's go to the website in your department, Office of Tax Analysis. It provides a distributional analysis for all major taxes. I ask unanimous consent to put this in the record.
Without objection, so ordered.
This analysis shows that households with income below 310,000 bear approximately 37% of the corporate tax under current law. The fact is that millions of middle-class Americans with 401ks or IRAs bear the burden of the corporate taxes, as do workers in the form of lower wages. So my question, based on Treasury's own analysis of the corporate tax burden, isn't it true middle-class Americans will shoulder the burden of the president's tax hike to the tune of hundreds of billions of dollars?
So I think what the impact when you change taxes on corporations, what the impact is on families involves a lot of channels that are speculative. They are included in models that sometimes the Treasury uses for the purpose of analysis, but a tax that is levied on corporations that has no obvious direct effect on households, I don't believe the president would regard as raising taxes on families making under $400,000.
Well, we all know that corporations are just a tool to pass through taxes to either management, consumers, or workers. And I think that it's realistic to say that the president's tax is going to hit people with either lower wages or salaries, or the consumers are going to pay it.
I think if you look at the entire budget and the president's overall program, what you will see is a budget that not only reduces the deficit by about $3 trillion, but also invests in our economy in ways that especially benefit low-income workers and the middle class. It reflects an approach I've called modern supply-side economics, which is already showing itself to be tremendously effective in generating investment in our economy and is creating jobs all throughout the country.
I want to move on. The president's budget purports to stabilize the national debt as a share of the economy at levels that rival World War II records. Even the Bloomberg editorial board, in a recent article that expressed support for much of the president's agenda, questioned the administration's math. This is because the budget relies on rosy economic and interest rate assumptions, along with many other gimmicks. This includes assuming the 2017 tax law expires, which would mean $2 trillion tax hike on those earning under $400,000, a direct violation of the president's pledge. Rather than being fiscally responsible, doesn't the president's budget, by making no real effort to address runaway spending and the middle class up for a larger tax hikes down the road? Isn't that what the budget does?
Well, I would strongly disagree with that description of the budget. First of all, the economic assumptions, if anything, are less optimistic than current data suggests. Economic growth is proven stronger, the labor market stronger than is reflected in our economic assumptions. The economic assumptions do show a rise in interest rates, which does impact debt service cost. But the most important metric of sustainability of fiscal policy is real net interest paid on the debt, and that is stabilized in the president's budget.
Let me sum it up this way. You're telling us much more optimistic than what we hear from our own Congressional Budget Office.
Well,
Time of the gentleman has expired. Senator Cassidy is next.
Hey, Madam Secretary, thank you for being here. Madam Secretary, as we know, Social Security goes insolvent in 8 to 9 years. The president has not put out a plan, he's put out a series of talking points.
I'm listening to whistleblowers throughout the bureaucracy, so let me speak about, I know on July the 21st, 2023, IRS Supervisor Special Agent Gary Shapley emailed you asking that you direct senior IRS leadership to stop retaliating against him. On May the 18th last year, IRS Special Agent Joseph Ziegler emailed you to disclose his concerns about the IRS handling of a case that he was working on. I have an opportunity to talk to these. So I know that they've asked to meet with you, what they wanted to discuss with you. I would assume they want to tell you what's wrong within handling of certain cases. And I would think you at the top of the IRS would want to listen to them. So I'm not going to ask you a question, but I'm going to do now what I told them I would do. I was going to ask you to meet with the two of them and just listen to them. Whether you take action or not is up to you, but I think you ought to at least listen to them. I think whistleblowers throughout government are some of the most patriotic people I know, and I would ask you to do that. Now I want to go to my first question. The IRS whistleblower program, which you know I was involved in getting enacted, that's brought $6 billion into the federal government. It's been a pretty effective and efficient program, but we have this problem of the average wait time for people to get their case closed has gotten longer and is now up to 10 years. The long average wait time is in part due to the IRS policy against paying partial awards. Under this policy, the IRS will wait years until all the years of claims are completed to pay anything whatsoever. Effectively, the IRS has created barriers to pay awards on its own that are not in the whistleblower statute passed by Congress. So you need to examine the unnecessary policy in the IRS revenue manual and work to allow partial awards to be paid to whistleblowers as quickly as possible. Could you do that?
Senator, I'm glad you asked the question. Between the question that Senator Crapo asked on identity theft backlogs and your question on the backlog on our whistleblower claims, you're pointing to two very high priorities as we move forward. As I said in my opening statement, we've had a good filing season, but we have a lot more work to do. And these are two areas. I will commit to, that is an interesting recommendation on partial payments and the way we can potentially accelerate how whistleblowers who are providing such valuable information to us get their fair share of the money that they saved for the American taxpayer. So we will look into that, and I will get back to you. And also, since I didn't get an opportunity, Senator Crapo, I will get back to you on identity theft, another big priority and a big issue that we have to do better at.
I'm glad that whoever makes arrests for people that violate the law in IRS, because this one contractor is now serving 5 years for disclosing information. But I kind of wonder how an activist like him, who wants to be contracted, who presumably got a job for the sole purpose of making public information about taxpayers. In this case, I guess he was after Trump's tax returns. How was an activist with plans to steal taxpayer information able to get hired and gain access to taxpayer information? And what action has the IRS taken to ensure an active employee or contractor is never again able to access and share sensitive taxpayer information?
Thank you for the question. Protecting taxpayer information from unauthorized access is an absolutely solemn responsibility of the IRS. The individual you reference betrayed the trust of the IRS and the American people. It's a betrayal that cannot be tolerated. And based on what played out in court, it is not being tolerated, as this bad actor was brought to justice and will be serving a 5-year term in prison. From my first day on the job back in March of 23, it is a top priority to strengthen the data security at the IRS. And we have taken numerous steps to address this, working with TIGDA to make sure that we have their to-do list aligned with our to-do list. Fewer users, more robust encryption, stronger oversight, better access logs, less removable media, tighter email controls, new printer controls. All of this is ongoing and being put in place to make sure that this type of unauthorized access by a contractor, in this case it was a contractor, or an IRS employee, can never happen again. There's always going to be that risk. What you try to do is narrow the risk to as small as it possibly can be. Insider threats and unauthorized access from insider threats, it's impossible to get rid of completely. But I am committed to reducing the probability to as small as it can be by putting in the sweat equity to close all those gaps.
Commissioner, I'm Senator Grassley's partner on the whistleblower effort, have been for years. I very much support the fact that you're going to make those issues about whistleblowers.
Ambassador, I'd like to discuss a prime example of this administration's abdication of leadership on trade. There's been a bipartisan agreement on this committee on critical issues such as free cross-border data flow, data localization, open markets, and intellectual property protection. However, this has been undermined by actions of this administration, so other countries then end up setting the rules on digital trade. These bipartisan principles are the foundation of the digital economy, and U.S. companies enjoy a significant competitive advantage relative to foreign competitors. Our competitors repeatedly seek to discriminate against U.S. companies and impede access to their markets, yet the Biden administration has pulled back from negotiations on digital service trades and rejected long-term, long-held bipartisan principles against discriminatory practices of our partners. USTR has abdicated its leadership role in this important issue. So why is USTR allowing other countries to set the rules that will put American companies at a disadvantage? This can't be consistent with USTR's mission.
Senator Grassley, it's good to see you. Thank you for the question. And thank you for the opportunity to address this concern that you have. I've heard it quite a bit, and I welcome every opportunity to explain USTR's approach. You are right with respect to ongoing negotiations around data flows provisions, data localization provisions, and source code provisions. We have pulled back these long-standing proposals that we have made in those negotiations to make adjustments, in large part because we are connecting the dots. And I would like to encourage all of us to connect the dots, because in addition to being a Senate Finance Committee leader, you've also been a longtime leader on the Senate Judiciary Committee. And I know, for instance, that you are a co-sponsor of the American Innovation and Choice Online Act, ICOA, which the administration has expressed support for. I also know that you are a co-sponsor, along with many of your colleagues on both sides of the aisle here on Senate Finance, of the Kids Online Safety Act, which addresses data security for children's data in the digital economy and in the digital sphere. What I wanted to reflect to you is when you look at those long-term developed proposals in the digital trade negotiations on data, that those provisions are still largely based on an understanding that what we're dealing with is data as a facilitator of traditional trade transactions, goods transactions, data as a facilitator of e-commerce, data traveling along with, the information that has to be traded in order for goods to move across borders. And that was certainly the case 20 years ago. But today in 2024, what we have seen is that data has become the commodity itself, that data has become the powerful thing that has value, that enables more innovation, that it enables, when you accumulate enormous amounts of it, technological innovation like generative AI. The issue is who can have access to that data, and also where does the data come from? It comes from ordinary Americans. It comes from you, it comes from me, it comes from your constituents, it comes from our kids. And so with respect to the security of that data, the attempts that we see up here on the Hill to assert the rights of ordinary Americans with respect to that data as a trade matter.
Can you fill in writing, because I've got to ask one more question.
All right, can I just finish? I'll just finish my sentence. We feel very strongly that our provisions in our trade negotiations should reflect the debates that are happening here and the legislative efforts that you all are making.
Yeah. The last time you appeared before this committee, I urged you to negotiate lower tariffs on ethanol with Brazil. While I understand that you are currently negotiating this matter, the results have been lackluster. Brazil increased its duty on ethanol this year from 16 to 18% and continue to enjoy importing its ethanol tariffs free. This ethanol competes with homegrown ethanol in California's low carbon fuel standard, but also in sustainable aviation fuel. What is the administration doing to press Brazil's to lower its tariffs, and what concrete measures are the administration considering in the negotiations?
Senator Grassley, your position on ethanol has been crystal clear from day one. This is a high priority for the administration as well. I'm currently also extremely concerned about Brazilian market access restrictions. We are in coordination with USDA, including at political levels, actively engaging with our counterparts in Brazil on market access barriers to U.S. ethanol, including those tariffs and regulatory barriers that you're talking about. Our objective is to ensure that U.S. ethanol can once again compete on a level playing field with domestically produced ethanol in Brazil. My latest engagement with my Brazilian counterpart, which happened about a month and a half ago, the Brazilians indicated to us that they understood at all levels, including from the White House, the prioritization of this issue with them, how important it is to us and our economy, and their desire to find a way to accommodate this priority. So we are actively working on it, and the strength of your voice on this matter is an asset to us.
Time of my colleagues expired. Senator Cornyn is next.
Little ethanol. You can ask about big oil if you want to.
Senator Cornyn.
Sorry.
Next, Senator Grassley, followed by Senator Padilla.
Mr. Ratner, I got some questions about how unrealistic some of these goals are. Not that they aren't worthy goals, but that they're unrealistic. You're a nonpartisan energy policy specialist who spent his entire career as an international oil and gas expert. Before your time in the CIA, you spent 4 years at Enron, so you experienced firsthand the impact of corporate fraud and corruption. Now that you've heard claims of a concerted, overwhelming conspiracy to defraud the public of climate change information, have you seen any evidence to support the Democrats' claims of fossil fuel industry deception?
Thank you, Senator. During the course of my career, I've never come across anything that to the likes that have been mentioned here today.
Okay. Also for you, your testimony notes that, pardon me, your testimony notes that fossil fuel comprise 84% of U.S. energy consumption in 2022? What would it mean for the U.S. gasoline and international gas prices if all new and expanded oil gas exploration immediately ceased as advocated by some of my colleagues as well as the staff report? That's the report I referred to in my opening comments.
Sure. I think the initial announcement would send certain shockwaves and uncertainty to the market that basically was saying the U.S. is going to be pulling out of the global fossil fuel industry, whether it's oil or gas and petroleum products. And eventually, as that happened, you would see upward pressure on prices globally for those products.
Okay. And Dr. Cohen, if Democrats had their way, they would destroy America's fossil fuel production through excessive regulation and limited taxation at a time when Americans can least afford it. In your view, in your point of view, what is the difference between tobacco and fossil fuel commodities? What impact would a massive oil and gas supply reduction have on geopolitical conflict and the U.S. economy?
Senator, as I'm saying in my testimony, an abrupt halt to all fossil fuel production in this country would be an economic suicide. The fundamental difference between tobacco and fossil fuel industry is that fossil fuel industry brings a tangible economic good to the economy. Without it, we cannot have our transportation, our deliveries, our military machines, planes, tanks moving around. So I hope that nobody in their right mind is advocating immediate cessation of fossil fuel production.
Would you care to comment on the first part of my question about the difference between tobacco and fossil fuel commodities?
As I said, tobacco, the science is establishing that the only thing tobacco does is addiction and health harm. Fossil fuel, on the other hand, as polluting as it may be, produces huge amounts of relatively cheap and concentrated energy, and without it, our economy and our society would collapse.
I apologize for missing your point on tobacco. My last question.
Yes, sir.
In their staff report, the Democrats condemned the description of natural gas as a bridge fuel. They call it deception. These are quotes: deception, disinformation, and doublespeak, end of quote. Is this true?
I think vilifying an industry that was the backbone of U.S. economic growth in the last part of the 19th century and for all of 20th century is speaking to a certain agenda. The speakers here talked about methane emissions, that yes, there are methane emissions, but the leading industry that contributes to methane emissions is animal husbandry and agriculture. Nobody talked about that. The fossil fuel industry produces less methane than agriculture. What are we going to do about that?
Okay. Thank you, Senator Grassley. Senator Padilla. Oh, and just for the record, I believe that the deception related to the characterization of natural gas as a bridge fuel has to do with the industry's intentions that it actually not be a bridge fuel. As the exhibit said, that it was a bridge fuel, but also a destination fuel for the long term. So the deception was pretending that natural gas would be a temporary bridge fuel in a transition to a clean energy economy when that was not actually the industry's intention. Just to be clear. Senator Padilla.
Grassley, you're next.
Thank you. I was over in Judiciary, so I missed your testimony. Thank you for appearing before us. I'm going to start out with Dr. Michel and Dr. Rouget. In 1981, former Federal Reserve Chairman Volcker testified before the Senate Banking Committee at a time of growing deficits and elevated inflation. As part of his testimony, he called on Congress to cut spending while also pursuing pro-growth policies. With respect to taxes, he urged Congress to focus on reforms that would incentivize Americans, in his words, to invest, to save, and to work. Are the prescriptions laid out by Chairman Volcker in 1981 good guiding principles for Congress today?
Thank you, Senator Grassley. Well, it looks like Chairman Volcker understood that there's actually a connection between the monetary side and the fiscal side while fighting inflation, and that the Federal Reserve can't do it alone. And it seemed that his prescriptions are really important, because one of the things that happens when the Federal Reserve raises interest rate is that it actually makes interest payment more expensive, increase the need for borrowing, hence fueling inflation. But also increasing growth by freeing the supply side is also a way to actually help fight inflation. So it seems that, yes, they are really good prescription. And unfortunately, I'm worried that actually the fact that there's no talk about austerity right now, however you want to define it, means it's fueling inflation. It's making the job of the Fed even harder. I'm worried that the increase of tariffs is actually constraining the supply side. There's just a lot of things happening that actually make it much harder for the Federal Reserve to really lower inflation to target.
Dr. Michel?
I'll add that with debt at 100% of GDP or higher, trending towards $2 trillion deficits, a $400 billion a year tax increase hanging over Americans' heads at the end of 2025 when the 2017 tax cuts expire. All of this depresses economic activity. Businesses and individuals have to plan for the future. And if they know that they're going to have to be sending more money to Washington, they're going to do less of all of the productive activities that grow the economy, expand the supply side, make it easier to fight inflation. And so those sort of fiscal threats that are hanging out in the future are certainly making things harder, and something that was certainly understood at the time by Chairman Volcker.
Also, Dr. Michel, your testimony discusses how our current tax code disincentives savings and recommends policies to counteract that bias. Last Congress, I introduced the Middle Class Savings and Investment Act that would effectively exempt the middle class from tax on most of their savings and investment income. It would do this by aligning the current zero tax rate bracket for capital gains and dividends with a 22% income tax bracket and excluding a modest amount of interest income from tax. Do you agree that the proposal along these lines could significantly reduce the current tax code bias against savings? And I'm not asking you to endorse the bill, just the philosophy.
Yeah, well, thank you for your leadership on this issue, and certainly the additional layers of taxes through capital gains, on dividends, on interest, all decrease savings. And to the extent that we can expand the number of Americans that don't get hit by these taxes and simplifying them by aligning brackets as your bill does, all of that pushes in the direction of giving more Americans greater opportunity to save and invest their own income. So certainly a great way of encouraging investment, and we should continue to push in expanding these types of policies.
Dr. Rouget, many of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle claim our mounting debt and deficit can be solved solely by taxing the wealthy. Isn't it true that absent spending reductions, tax hikes for middle-class Americans will become inevitable?
Yes, the answer is yes. And the reason there are two. First, there's not enough tax revenue that can actually address our debt problem. right? That's the first thing. Plus, raising taxes to the level that would require, would be very detrimental to growth, which hence would then backfire. But there's also a really big economic literature about the best way to reduce the debt to GDP ratio. It's been conducted in like 180 different countries, looking at what they've done to succeed and what they have done when they didn't succeed. And what that literature finds is that the best way to reduce the debt to GDP ratio is to enact fiscal adjustments that are mostly based on spending cuts, preferably transfer, social spending, like, so that's entitlement in the American context. The bad news from this literature is that actually, in spite of the fact that we know what we should do, a lot of the time, legislators choose to implement packages that are mostly made of taxes, and hence they fail. There's, by the way, another good news from...
Doctor, we're just going to have to move on.
Sure.
Okay?
Go on for a long time talking about fiscal adjustments.
Great. Senator Barrasso.
Thank you. I'll do my questions, and Senator Johnson will do his. We expect Rick Scott of Florida to come at a later date to ask questions as well. The three of you made protected disclosures regarding DHS and Border Patrol failures to obtain DNA from illegal immigrants at the southern border as required by the law. And based on your opening statements, the Biden-Harris administration has failed to comply with the DNA Fingerprint Act. Mr. Jones, I'd like to start with a threshold question. How do DNA profiles help DHS, CBP, and other law enforcement agencies protect our communities and at the same time secure our border?
Senator Johnson, the DNA profiles that are generated by the collection at the border allows law enforcement to then log those DNA profiles in the CODIS database. If there is a latent or a crime scene DNA sample that is in that database, then it gives law enforcement an actual lead or investigative track to be able to reopen or open a cold case. The majority of the cases in that database, 45 to 50%, are sexual assault and rape, followed closely by homicide. In our experience since 2020, we have seen very interesting and promising results that come from these DNA profiles being loaded. The oldest case that was reopened, sir, was from 1972, which was actually a sexual assault. So the value to law enforcement is immeasurable. It's in addition to fingerprints and photographs, and it gives our state, local, and tribal authorities the ability to follow up on cases. It gives victims and their families a level of closure, and it can also exonerate those that have been possibly wrongly accused.
If the Biden-Harris administration followed the law instead of flouting it, how would that have played a role in preventing the murder of Rachel Moran? For you, Mr. Jones.
Sir, as we look at the failures and successes, even at the 37% threshold that we're seeing today, in focusing on the case you referenced, we know that the subject was encountered by CBP and DHS at least 3 times. His DNA was never collected. On his 4th trip across the border, he's said to be a got-away. He avoided DHS and CBP, Border Patrol, and was able to get into the United States. He ended up in California, and in March of last year, he was involved, according to law enforcement, in a home invasion and sexual assault of a mother and her 9-year-old child. In that encounter, law enforcement was able to collect DNA samples and sent them to CODIS. Unfortunately, there was no match because we did not collect his DNA as we should have. From March and until August, there was no investigative lead that would have led us to the subject. Do we know if we had that investigative lead and had identified the subject, we could have located him? Possibly. We know that there would have been an NCIC record placed into the federal law enforcement system that said if any state, local, or federal agency encountered this subject, he would have popped as a person of interest in the original home invasion and sexual assault of a mother and a child. He could have been apprehended. We could have had a person to look for. Do we know if we could have absolutely prevented Rachel Morin's rape and murder? We don't know that, sir, but we do know that if we were able to identify this subject earlier, he would have been on law enforcement's radar and potentially apprehended.
Also for you, the administration's DHS and CBP aren't collecting DNA at some locations at the southern border. Where, why, and what's the impact on our national security?
Sir, Senator, a colleague of ours was visiting sites along the southern border, and they went to approximately 12 sites, and neither Border Patrol nor Office of Field Operations were collecting DNA at any of those sites while they were present. They asked the officer and agents why they weren't doing it, and the response our person told us was, they're just not doing it. The impact is, again, we are allowing investigative leads to get past us, and we're frankly violating the very law that was passed by Congress in 2006 and implemented by the Department of Justice law enforcement entities in 2009. So the impact is clear.
Mr. Taylor, regarding the ongoing whistleblower court case with your colleagues, has the administration, DHS and CBP, made false or misleading statements internally or explained or public about it? If so, please explain.
Yes, Senator Grassley. When the Office of Special Counsel began investigating our allegations of whistleblower reprisal, this started back in 2018, CBP told the Office of Special Counsel that we were poor performers and were about to be fired. When the OSC pointed out that we'd received significant awards and public recognition for our outstanding work 6 weeks before the dismantling of our group, CBP then stated that we weren't a good fit in our current organizational location. When the OSC told CBP that we were reprised against and should be restored to our previous position, CBP told the OSC that the funding was no longer available. When the OSC pointed out that CBP's recently submitted budget included expanding the number of personnel in our WMD division by 500% over the next 5 years, CBP said that that money was reappropriated. A seemingly innocuous email sent by me to CBP's Finance Center confirmed that the WMD funding was indeed available and currently being utilized elsewhere by CBP, as it is today. In fact, one of our salaries, as Mr. Jones had articulated earlier, has been paid out of the WMD budget for the last six plus years, proving our point that the Office of Special Counsel has been perpetually lied to by CBP. Numerous individuals in multiple offices in CBP have made known false statements to the OSC, the Merit Systems Protection Board. They've also made known false statements to congressional oversight groups. CBP's table of offenses clearly articulates that the penalty for knowingly making a false statement in an official inquiry is removal. There are no mitigating factors, and yet no one has been disciplined. On September 23rd, Senators, you are aware, you wrote to Secretary Mayorkas and Acting Commissioner Troy Miller about CBP making false statements to the press. Your staff had confirmed with the Office of Special Counsel twice that the Office of Special Counsel had sought corrective action on our behalf. CBP made public statements to the New York Post stating, quote, "The Office of Special Counsel terminated its investigation into these claims without issuing a prohibited personnel practice report or seeking corrective action. That is clearly a lie. Rather than issue a retraction, CBP stated that, quote, "This is a mischaracterization of this issue based on incomplete records, and we are unable to comment further based on open litigation regarding these cases." Lie, deflect, and lie some more has been a winning strategy for CBP since 2018. They are lawless and proving to be accountable to no one. As we've mentioned to the various oversight groups we've spoken to, Senator, CBP is the equivalent of a multi-billion-dollar corporation. They have their own press corps, and they can make statements to the press regardless of how dishonest or untruthful they are. And they're given the benefit of the doubt that the average citizen would not believe that an agency would openly make a public statement that was so patently untrue. As you are aware, and your staff called CBP out on this factual and known misstatement, they continue to do so and operate in all these facets with impunity.
Okay, I'll stop and let you, you go ahead. Are you done, sir?
Yes, Senator. Thank you.
Okay, go ahead.
Next on the Senate Judiciary Committee is Senator Grassley.
Yeah. Mr. Chairman, I'd like to introduce my oversight letters and investigative documents into the record. This is information I've already made public.
Without objection.
Okay, thank you. I'd also like to call my colleagues' attention to a legislation that Senator Cortez Mastos and I've introduced would require Senate confirmation of the Director of the Secret Service. I think this is very important because no other agency has a no-fail mission. Mr. Rohr, in your written testimony, you stated that that to prevent similar lapses like the one on July 13th from happening again, you'll ensure every event site security plan is thoroughly vetted by multiple experienced supervisors before it's implemented. Based on your testimony, the security plan for the Butler event deviated from the Social Security standards. How would vetting by multiple experienced supervisors fix that?
So, Senator, I think having many eyes on a particular problem set helps. That way you don't have tunnel vision. You just focus in on one thing. And so that's why I think it's important, not only at the field office level, but also at the detail level. And part of what we had started doing with the former president's detail is having them send out site agents, having them send out supervisors. And I think having that collaboration and having additional eyes to examine the problem will make sure that we're not missing anything. And I think I want that surety for myself. I think
you've answered my question.
Yes,
Let me
sir.
go on. Also to you, in your written testimony, you stated that you, quote, regret that information wasn't passed to Congress and the public sooner and with greater frequency. What's your communication plan going forward to ensure that the American people in Congress are fully informed?
So, Senator, we just started a rolling production that is bicameral. So we made our first rolling production last week. We made one yesterday. We will continue to do that. And my view is that sunshine is the best disinfectant, and we intend to provide information to Congress as it carries out its oversight function.
Okay, also to you, I made public documents that show Secret Service deployed a counter unmanned aerial system operator on July the 13th. According to the Secret Service, the drone system was supposed to be operational at 3 p.m. that day. However, we've been told by Secret Service that because of cellular bandwidth problems, it wasn't operational until about 5:20 of that day. If the system was operational, Secret Service would have had the ability to detect the shooter and his own drone use. Why is the Secret Service dependent upon local cellular network? Does the Secret Service have a backup plan in place?
Yes, thank you, Senator. And that is something that I briefed in the closed door, and again, something that has cost me a lot of sleep because of the eventual outcome of the assailant. That what if we had geolocated him because that counter-UAS platform had been up? It is something that I have struggled with to understand, and I have no explanation for it.
Okay.
It is something that I feel as though we could have perhaps found him. We could have maybe stopped him. Maybe on that particular day, he would have decided this isn't the day to do it because law enforcement just found me flying my drone. People fly drones all the time on the peripheries of our sites. And we go out and we talk to them and we ascertain what their intentions are. On this day in particular, because of the connectivity challenge, as you noted, there was a delay, and he flew his drone at 3:51 approximately. So moving forward, we are leveraging resources from the Department of Homeland Security and others to make sure that we have dedicated connectivity so that we're not reliant on public domain, so that we can ensure that whatever assets we have in place, those assets are operational. And that is my commitment to you, that we are going to make sure we're going to do that, and that is something we are moving out on.
Thank you, and I hope that you'll answer some of my other questions in writing.
Senator Johnson, recognized for your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Yeah. Mr. Chairman, before I ask questions, I have two articles. One highlights actors with ties to Iran attempting to influence and finance anti-Israel protests in our country. The other article mentions that Russia is also trying to exploit divisions over the Israel-Hamas conflict. Rabbi?
Without objection, they'll be entered in the record. Proceed.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Are some of the higher education institutions either wittingly or unwittingly shielding or even fostering anti-Semitism in the United States today? Rabbi?
Thank you, Senator, for that question. Yes, I'll point you to a study done by the Institute for the Study of Global Anti-Semitism and Policy, which found that at least 100 American colleges and universities illegally withheld information on approximately $13 billion in undocumented contributions from foreign governments, many of which are authoritarian. The study found higher levels of anti-Semitic incidents reported on those campuses. From 2015 to 2020. Institutions that accepted money from Middle Eastern donors had, on average, 300% more anti-Semitic incidents on campus than institutions that did not. And campus-level anti-Semitic incidents, by the way, forward predict county-level anti-Semitic incidents, including hate crimes.
Further question, Rabbi. Have the Department of Justice and Department of Education in this administration done enough to address epidemic of hate speech and anti-Semitism on the college campuses? And if the answer is yes or no, what more should the administration do from your opinion?
Unfortunately, they have done nowhere near enough. They should enforce the laws as written, including Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. If the words of Title VI mean anything, it talks about, behavior that is severe and pervasive enough that it interferes with the person's education. They have to mean something that has to include what's happening to Jewish students on campus right now. And we have seen 0 universities lose their funding, even as these encampments literally force Jews out of parts of the school. So no, they have not done more, and they should also enforce laws like the Nationality Act, which prohibit foreign students from providing material support to terrorism.
Yeah. You gave some evidence about the amount of money being spent by terrorist groups, but what have you discovered about Hamas's potential funding of college protests, and what evidence have you relied on to form your opinion?
Well, it actually goes beyond funding, Senator. Going back to the Supreme Court case in Holder versus Humanitarian Law in 2010, it's not just money that counts, it's services as well. And unfortunately, these student groups on campus are literally acting as the PR agents of Hamas. Some countries spend up to $200 million a year on PR firms. Hamas can't because they're an FTO. But immediately after October 7th, some of these groups, like the National Students for Justice in Palestine, came out and said, we are not just in solidarity with this movement, we are part of this movement. They chanted, we are Hamas. And when a group tells you that they are trying to provide material support to terrorists, you should believe them. And so it's not just an exchange of money, it's a coordination with Hamas that is a terrible problem.
In the same vein as my question just asked, there have been media reports citing Iran, Russia, and other international actors as taking advantage and stoking civil rights unrest here. What do you think, Rabbi, what do you think can be done to counter this malignant influence?
I think in general, Senator, we need better tracking of the kind of donations that are coming from overseas, whether it's to 501c3s that are in theory acting as charities, but are actually, as in the case of the Palestine Chronicle, for example, literally paying money to a terrorist that was holding 4 hostages in his house, 3 hostages in his house. I think that it would behoove the United States government to remove the tax status of any charity that provides material support to terrorists.
Yeah. And I think you've talked around this next question I have, but I'd like to ask it more directly, Rabbi. What has allowed for the recent rise of anti-Semitism and hate in our communities?
Senator, that's a very hard question to answer. It is really difficult to talk about why anti-Semitism persists. It's the kind of thing that is a mutating virus. Different parts of society hate Jews for being whatever they don't like. So Jews are at the same time too strong and too weak. They're parasitic and overpowering. They are superhuman, like in the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, or they're subhuman, like in Nazi ideology. It's what has led to the problem and the infestation of anti-Semitism is the fact that we don't have clear definitions that authorities can use to rely on when they're trying to assess the intent behind anti-Semitic crime. So, for example, everyone here knows that if you attack a Chinese person because you think they have unfair trade policies, that is ethnic or national origin discrimination. If you attack a Russian person because you think Russia should not have invaded Ukraine, that is national origin or ethnic discrimination. But if you attack a Jewish person because you hate Israel, for some reason there's some confusion. We need clear definitions, and that will do the job.
Senator Grassley.
I'm leading up to a question for Professor Mascott, repeating a little bit what Senator Lee just said. For the last several years, the other side has ratcheted up the political rhetoric against conservatives and other countries in our country's democratic institutions. More recently, they've directed their focus and ire on the U.S. Supreme Court. They've dubbed the Supreme Court as a MAGA court. They've referred to the current member makeup as somehow radical. The Senate Democratic leader threatened to release a whirlwind, as you know all about that statement. Unfortunately, this has all come as a tremendous cost. Justices and their families have endured ongoing picketing outside of their homes, scenes of public intimidation, harassment, and now death threats. Needless to say, this is all totally unacceptable. So to you, Professor, does America have a MAGA Supreme Court, and how would you describe this characterization?
Well, I mean, we have a Supreme Court, and I agree with a lot of what the senators have said and Chairman Graham, where I believe every justice on the Supreme Court's trying to carry out what they believe their constitutional duty is. It's coming under unprecedented attack, which we have not seen, in many years, with breaches of confidentiality across the branches, people facing attacks and threats. And I think it's our, duty here testifying today and setting these actions to do what we can to make sure that they're portrayed in an accurate light and be careful and studied with what they talk about. With respect to this current decision, as you know, the Supreme Court doesn't reach out to take cases. It takes the cases that come to it. And what prompted this was really the unprecedented nature of the criminal prosecution in this case of the current administration prosecuting a current political rival.
Okay, Judge Mukasey, could you briefly describe how the recent Supreme Court presidential immunity case builds upon previous legal precedent and doesn't give the president the authority to have political enemies terminated?
Well, as I pointed out, there is Nixon against Fitzgerald established the principle that there are that there are immunity principles that apply to the presidency. This is a logical extension or plausible extension of that decision. Marbury versus Madison pointed out that the decisions of the president are not subject to examination by the courts. the notion that somehow the president is immune from prosecution for imagined acts, I think is way beyond what the majority said. Just to offer a less dramatic, but nonetheless equally far-fetched example, if the president, as commander-in-chief, ordered the military to shoplift a tie that he wanted to wear to deliver the State of the Union address, that would not be something that is for which there is immunity. Yes, he's commander-in-chief of the armed forces, but shoplifting is not among the prerogatives that he has to order.
Judge McCasey, can you briefly explain some other attempts to exert political pressure on the judiciary, and what was the results of those?
Well, there have been, as was pointed out, there have been threats to limit the budget of the judiciary. There have been threats to strip the judiciary of its jurisdiction, and I think those are very dangerous, and ultimately will wind up damaging the liberties of all Americans.
Professor Mascott, broadly speaking, can a federal statute overturn a constitutional interpretation by the Supreme Court, or would a constitutional amendment likely be required?
Well, in our system, we treat the interpretations by the Supreme Court as a final judgment. So a federal statute, no, would not overturn it. You would need a constitutional amendment, and that's intentional because of the high bar that it takes with the support of 3/4 of the states to be able to get a constitutional amendment, to be able to override previous understandings of the Constitution.
I yield back.
Senator Welch.
We turn to Senator Grassley, and I think it'll be Senator Kaine after that.
Mr. Pinto, when President Biden was still running for president, his campaign released a plan in July that promised to build 2 million homes in 5 years. 2 months later, the Harris campaign proposed roughly the same plan, but now promised to build 3 million homes and now do that in 4 years instead of 5 years. Mr. Pinto, the home building industry already builds over 1 million homes each year. Is the industry able to roughly double its production and meet these expectations, in addition to whether or not the housing supply increase is attainable? What is the impact of the housing market and on the economy of the Harris plan to offer subsidies of $25,000 down payment? Windfall.
Thank you, Senator Grassley. So in 2023, there were about 1.4 million building permits, housing starts for both single family and multifamily. And if you think about the 3 million over 4 years, you would be starting out at a smaller number. You'd probably end in the 4th year with about 1 million. So you'd be taking the 1.4 million up to about 2.4 million at the end of 4 years. That's commensurate with the increase, as I said in my testimony, that occurred from 1969 after the 1968 Housing Act was passed to 1972. And the results of running things up so quickly with all the subsidies that accompanied it and the loose lending was disastrous. So I think that's one scenario. The temptation will be to then loosen lending at the same time, which will lead to disastrous results. In terms of the home builders being able to handle that, I think it would be very difficult. But again, what happens when you throw all that money out, you end up with a lot of corruption. And there's a book that was written that I keep on my bookshelf in about 1972 or 1973 by a reporter from Detroit called Cities Destroyed for Cash, the scandal at FHA. And it was just documenting the corruption that occurred at FHA during these programs. The 235 program is the specific program that was largely involved. In terms of the down payment assistance, as I mentioned, there would first of all be an increase of 3.6% in all of the areas that these first-time buyers receiving this assistance would be price setters. How do we know that? Well, we've studied other times that the federal government has made changes that allows us to measure this impact. In particular, in 2015, when FHA lowered its mortgage insurance premium from 135 basis points to 85 basis points, we had a similar experiment. Certain people, FHA borrowers, were getting extra buying power. The other people in the market did not, because they were not affected by the decline in the premium. We then could study the impact on home prices, and we found that that impact was substantial and it was widespread. That, again, this price setter impact occurred. We also know then we can calculate what the total cost that would be spent on due to the increase in home prices, and that's the $175 billion that I mentioned. That's more than the cost of the program. But that money's going directly to existing home buyers. That would perpetuate a practice that Congress has had of providing demand-side subsidies, which then go directly to benefit the existing home buyers, not the first-time buyers they're intended to help.
Mr. Salmon, you testified that this nation's fiscal situation is very bad. We will pay more interest payments on our national debt than the cost of all housing assistance over the next 10 years. Vice President Harris proposed to increase federal spending, which means the national debt will continue to grow. So for you, would piling on even more federal spending drive up interest rates and make the goal of home ownership even less attainable?
Thank you, Senator Grassley. So more government spending deficits and debt will make this situation worse. We know from the economic literature on debt and economic growth that more debt impacts living standards in several ways, one of which is crowding out private investment, which means lower wage growth, means less job creation. One of which you mentioned is higher interest rates. About 1% increase in the debt ratio is correlated with about a 3 or 4 basis point increase in interest rates. And of course, these interest rates have a causal effect on mortgage rates, so that drives up the cost of home ownership in that respect. Another way is through higher future distortionary taxes, which aren't good for economic growth and development. And then finally, the one that we've become familiar with in recent years is inflation. We essentially inflate away the debt, but at the same time, we inflate away the purchasing power of American families to save.
Thank you.
Thanks very much, Senator Grassley. We now turn to Senator Kaine, followed by Senator Braun.